So the idea behind Experiments in Space initially was about getting different musicians into unusual spaces. And the first thing I really liked the idea of doing was to try and get a rock guitarist into Canterbury Cathedral to to see what it would sound like to have that kind of sound, that kind of tone in a space like Canterbury Cathedral. That was kind of my initial idea of what I wanted to do, was just to do that and to try and take in, you know, several microphones, different spaces, to try and capture the different sounds to see how they came out. That was the initial thing, and then I sort of started researching other spaces where we could put different players. But as the piece sort of evolved, I then actually became more interested in the idea of improvisation, and so the idea of the space became secondary. And what I actually wanted to do was to take 4 musicians with very different backgrounds, musical backgrounds that is, in terms of their education and their approach to music, and to get them all to do a piece of improvisation. Basically to see how the different people approached it, musically speaking. So what I ended up with is firstly a musician who's basically most of their career has been playing in bands, not musically trained, guitarist, who was essentially in a band that I grew up listening to called Levitation, and later a band called Dark Star, and also the Cardiacs. And this is a guy called Vic Hayes, and I basically contacted him to see if he'd be interested in this project, and he was. And so with him having absolutely no sort of musical training, as you'd understand it, I thought it'd be really interesting to see how he copes with it. So what I then did once I had him on board, I then looked for other people. So I got in a vocalist I've worked with before called Dave Gillies, who has a commercial music degree, and again has worked in bands and does songwriting as well. And then Julia, who's our cellist, and who obviously is classically trained, with some experience of improvisation, and Richard Navarro, who is a singer-songwriter, but also an excellent violinist. So these are the different musicians with different kind of backgrounds. I then constructed a piece that was about 11 minutes, which sort of had 5 sections to it, a couple of minutes each section, more or less. And I didn't let the players hear it. I didn't give them any kind of sheet music. I didn't give them any chord sheets or anything like that. Literally, they had to listen to it there and then in the space and respond to it musically. And it, you know, they all chose to, I think, respond straight away. So they hadn't heard it before, and they just started playing as they could hear it. And I allowed them 3 to 4 takes of each thing. So they could either listen to it once and then record 3 times, or they could just record 4 times, or in some cases they just recorded 3 times straight off. So the results are all, you know, have all been particularly interesting. So just to start with, the first thing we recorded with the guitars, and just to give you a bit of an example. So the guitars in Canterbury Cathedral by Bick, we close mic'd his amps. You can see here, close mic'd his amps, and then at the back of the space we put a mic at each end of the space in the cathedral. So we had one way back here and one behind there, you know, the sounds are quite interesting. If I play a little bit. And Bick's a really interesting guitarist because he's more about creating textures and sounds rather than just sort of typical riffs or anything like that. So whilst there is some natural reverb, there's some reverb on the amp. A lot of these sounds are just the sound of the cathedral space. Caught there.
Well, I suppose when I started music, I mean, as I say, I mean, I just got together when I was really young with people who wanted to play, be in bands, and none of us knew how to play. So you started off by renting a rehearsal studio, getting in there, and just seeing who could play what the best. So, and the way you discovered that was by just playing and improvising, and that's how we started. That's how I've always written songs with people, and that's how. It's always the genesis behind everything that I do, really, is improvisation. I wouldn't know because I've never sat down to write a song conventionally, really, and I've never learned anyone else's songs, which is sort of unusual because a lot of people, you know, that's how they learn. But as I said, I mean, I came through it. It was basically music was unattainable. I mean, you weren't a musician when I was a kid. It was like that. That was the sort of preserve of people who sort of came from the sky. And then punk rock happened, and it changed everything. It was like the idea that you could do it yourself, and that's how it started. It's like, oh, we can do this. So we started doing it, and that again was the beginning of it. So, I mean, a lot of people did do that, but we just seemed to bypass that. The people that I knew, we seemed to sort of approach it in a different way, a much freer way. And I don't really know why that was. It was just the way. I didn't think we never sat down to sort of think, right, we need to work out strong song structures. We need to do that. We just wanted to make a load of noise. I think it was just sort of like reckless abandon, really. Get in a room and make loads of noise, and through that you find your way. And I don't think that's that rare. I mean, if you look at sort of you know, some bands like Joy Division, I'm sure that's how they started. They never sat down, you know, with acoustic guitars and wrote songs and goes, they got in a room and they ended up playing quite weird styles because of that. And that's what interests me. And I think Pink Floyd did that at the beginning. Oh, just plug in and go, really. But I do tend to sort of hide behind loads of effects pedals and stuff. But that's, again, something that I really enjoy and interest, because I don't like normal sounds. I kind of retune things, always looking for sort of different or inspiring sounds. Or also, I'm really into the sounds of places, you know, and ambient sounds and noise that comes in everyday life. You know, there's all the stuff we filter out. I try to filter in because I'm really interested in that. All the stuff that we pretend's not there. I mean, I did some recording once where we were having trouble recording. It was just in a house I used to live at, and I was trying to record, and they started digging up the road outside, started drilling up the road, and it's like, well, I can't record today. And I thought, well, flipping on its head, I really want to. So I recorded them drilling up the road. And that ended up on the recording. So that was, and it was that really interested me, the idea that if you've got bad equipment or you've got a bad situation, you turn it around and make something of it. It did, because at the beginning, when I was listening to the room, I was having to be a lot more tentative because of the sound of the room and the big reverb. It tended to sort of make you play a lot quieter and sort of more delicately. So yes, it did. It's good. I love it. I mean, I love any opportunity to do something like this. I think it's great. I found it slightly more difficult because we were listening on headphones, but I hadn't thought of that before we got here and how we would do it. But that made it slightly odder and less free. But that's just the nature of the way we have to do it here.
What I've actually done in the end for the piece, I was thinking about doing a 5.1 mix, but in the end I've just gone with some fairly simple panning. So I've just taken one of the mics and panned it far right and one of the mics and panned it far left, which creates a nice sense of space when you put the two parts together. And then we have the close mics as well to bring a bit more definition. So this, I think, was interestingly with Bick and his approach. It turned out that actually his first take was probably the best, and actually the one that I've ended up using the most of. His natural response to what he heard was great. And again, it kind of makes sense if you look at his background, because he spent most of his, his musical life working with other people and responding to what's going on in the room. The next person we recorded was Julia, our cellist, who, again, she has some background, some in improvisation, but very much from a 20th century music kind of place. So it turned out that with a lot of the work that she did for me, some of it was going to push the piece too far beyond what I was comfortable with as a composer. Because the thing about this piece is that I'm used to being in control. So the idea of working with live musicians is great, but when I am working with them, I want to be able to say to them, can you do more of this? Can you do more of that? Can you follow that line? Can you harmonise with this? You know, I'm used to sort of explaining what I want. In this case, I didn't say anything. I left it purely up to them. So when Julia became more experimental, it sort of went beyond what I would naturally want to hear in my piece. And so when I've then sat here with all the audio and tried to piece it together and choose which bits to use, I had a decision to make whether I went more sort of atonal with it, or if I kept it fairly, you know, if I kept it more within where I would normally write. So there's moments that we've used with the cello that have been very interesting. That have worked very well within the piece, but there were other bits that she did that were perhaps just too far the other way, that bringing them in would have just seemed really at odds with everything else, especially with the harmonic language that I've used throughout the piece. And we recorded Julia in the Eastbridge Hospital, which was this building here, which is a sort of underground in the centre of Canterbury. It's a sort of underground, old underground hospital, which again had an interesting sort of sonic quality to it. So it was nowhere near as boomy as, say, the cathedral, but it was not. But it had sort of a nice sort of, because it's all stone walls, there was a nice sort of very gentle reverb on the whole thing. And we recorded that from 3 different places, and there are moments where I use all 3. For example, which also creates a wider sound, a sort of fatter sound, and then there's moments where I just go with the sort of the close-up mic, which gives it another quality. But again, at this point, I was less interested perhaps in the space, more interested in how they were actually responding to the piece.
It's more so in the last few years, specifically with people with special needs and disabilities and things who can't repeat things the same more than once. You have to be able to go with them, so that sort of thing. And also it's been a bit of a mission for me to try and free up enough to improvise, because that wasn't within my education, and I had a bit of a hang up, really. So yeah, it's quite evocative, isn't it? I mean, it's quite... Having a track in your ear, I think, affects how you play, because that takes you out of the space that you're in, in a way, because you're in sort of studio space. I think if I'd just been playing without a track, I would have been more aware of the surroundings, although, yeah, I don't know. Well, it's sort of slightly out of one's comfort zone. Because the music was in 5 sections, I heard it once before, I found it quite difficult to judge how long the sections were, and so therefore how much at a time, what was going on, because obviously it's just me responding to the track, and sometimes with improvising there's 2 people responding to each other, which is a different situation. So that was difficult for me to latch into the new sections.
So after Julia, we recorded Richard Navarro here. A really interesting songwriter who does these fascinating things with loops and effects. So he takes his violin, but then he uses a pickup on it and then takes it through an amp, which he then takes into his equipment. which basically means that he can play little lines and he can loop them and he can let them build up, and that kind of thing. And in many ways, what sounded fantastic out of context has worked the least successfully within context of the piece, partly because I think Richard's so used to building up his own textures, they just never quite managed to fit with what I had gone with for the piece. I mean, an example is, this is him sort of playing over himself, looping a part, and then carrying on. Yeah, which is great, and it sounds very good. However, when you're improvising to a piece where the harmonies continue changing, it doesn't sort of lend itself that well to having looped ideas. So there's moments which I've been able to use that have worked like that, and other moments which, whilst in the space they sounded amazing, when I actually got back here and started trying to put together, it wasn't working quite so well. In terms of the space, for Richard, we ended up recording at the Winter Gardens in Margate, which is a really awesome theatre space, which you can see here in the pictures. And we had Dave there for vocals and Richard for violin. Richard we actually recorded on the stage, as you can see here, and put, again, close-up mic and then a couple of mics further out. The space was actually quite noisy, and I've had to EQ a lot of the effects to try, a lot of the sounds to try and utilise some of the more spacious mics. But all in all, it was an interesting sound.
Improvising plays a huge part in my musical life. Every time I perform, I'm improvising, because the nature of looping is that you can start an idea and run with it, I suppose. So you can start with an idea and build layers on top. I tried today, I suppose, to try a number of different techniques and scales and ways of playing the violin. I was quite focused today on techniques and different techniques and sounds. I think maybe because the piece is itself quite rich, has some fantastic building harmonies, and I think, I mean, in terms of its bass and its so I was quite influenced by that, and yet I wanted to create some and I think first of all because I heard the interesting kind of sounds that were created, some of them more less harmonic, less tonal, and I wanted to try and imitate and add to that less harmonic sound, well, I suppose, which is what drove me towards using more of the plucked violin, of experimenting with tones on the violin, harmonics, and hitting it and so on. So I was pushed to try more, I suppose, extension of the techniques of the violin today. Yeah, absolutely. I think, I mean, I knew this was a lovely grand setting. I don't think I've been in here before, maybe once. But I knew it was a lovely grand theatrical setting, so, certainly I think in terms of the way I was performing, I was thinking in a less intimate sense and more in a kind of expansive sense, I suppose, to try and fill the space, and to I did throw in, a dose of theatricality, and that came through, I think, hopefully with the different sounds I was creating on the violin and the way in which I was playing it.
And then after we had got that done, we recorded Dave, our singer. Again, I wasn't sure how Dave would do with such a job like this, because being a singer, he's used to sort of having songs that he's either written or that he's covering or whatever, and he knows what he's got to do. In this case, we really put him on the spot and said just improvise. And what was great is he went about it in a fairly adventurous way. So he did a lot of breathing and rhythmical stuff. So things like that, which when put with the rest of the track, created some really interesting sort of rhythmical textures and things like that. Also, he has a very his note choices are very pop. They're very commercial. If in that he'll do things that, like example being here. So a line like that, you can imagine that being in a song, or so, you know, a blues track or something. And in a way, I was in two minds about whether I should use his stuff, because it was so kind of the other side of where the piece is. But I kind of felt like that's what he's bringing to it, and whereas when Julia, for example, was getting more outside of my comfort zone, it didn't quite fit. Whereas Dave's stuff, it's a little bit outside, but it still manages to fit. Probably because I, as a composer, am much more commercially minded, and my tonality is far less interesting than perhaps Julia's when she plays. So yeah, so by using Dave doing rhythmical things as well as sort of a more pop approach, he also does some falsetto stuff, which, you know, things like that are very effective when you put it with the whole piece.
Songwriting, I think it does, because generally I'll come up with like a set of chords, bash them out on a guitar, and then I'll play it back on loop and improvise over it whilst recording, and then I'll go back and listen if there's any nice bits, then that might make up the melody of the song. So I use it there, and in live performance I like to mix it up a little bit, mainly to keep it interesting. Like, otherwise you're just doing the same gig, it's just like karaoke singing, so I like to try and change it as much as possible. But I'd say that those two elements are probably the only times I really improvise. Mainly, I think, projection-wise, because normally, or recently, I've just been singing in the bedroom into a microphone, you know, or it might be a little pub somewhere, whereas this place is like big, and there's mics everywhere. So I wanted to make sure that a lot of the quiet stuff you're not going to hear a mile away, but then a lot of the boomy, loud, real projection stuff, it will be picked up on the mics over there. So I was trying to use a lot of dynamic, really, in like how I was singing. And also it's like a beautiful place, so it's bound to have some kind of subliminal effect on what I'm doing, you know. Really good. I really enjoyed it. I love the piece of music. I think that's the main thing. It feels very atmospheric and kind of harmonic as well. It just sounds really nice piece of music. So I actually found it quite, the first take was the easiest one, I think, even though I hadn't heard it. You know, I'd only heard it once. I really feel that was like the best take that we did. And the other three, I was just kind of more experimental. Whereas the first one, I think, was a little straighter and more contained. And I think that probably, I'd imagine, end up being the best one.
Essentially, what I sort of found is that, and obviously they all had their own experiences and how they responded to the space. But what I basically found was that the more successful, when I finally get back to the studio with the audio, the more successful approach came from the more sort of pop rock people. The less sort of, the more used to improvising they were naturally, the more comfortable they felt doing this. And the more they fell in line with my musical approach and my sort of harmonic language, which, kind of makes sense.